בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב, חודש טוב. Uh, it's an interesting turn move from Rav Elchanan Wasserman, about whom we spoke last week, to Rav Ben Zion Uziel, about whom we are going to speak, Bezat Hashem, this morning. They were different in almost any aspect that we can think of, from their origin, the place they came from, the beliefs that they held, the place that they took, almost everything. Nonetheless, both are important Jewish leaders and Torah teachers in our last generation, which I think is part of the strength of the Torah, that you have this variety. Many times it's also part of the challenges that we are facing. And Rav Uziel himself, as we will see, was a great proponent of harmony and unity in the word of Torah. He was very well aware of these challenges. So he was born, Rav Uziel, his first name was Ben Zion Meir Chai. He was born in 1880 in Old Yerushalayim. His father was Rav Rafael Uziel, an important rabbi in Yerushalayim, an Av Beidin. The family of Uziel was a family of rabbis, and also his mother, her name was Sarah, she came from the families of Dayan and Chazan, important rabbinical families from the Sephardic world. And when I say now Sephardi, I mean Sephardi in the most literal sense. People that can relate themselves back to old Spain, even knowing the cities they came from, and very proud in this heritage. Of course, speaking Ladino. And it's very interesting because, in a sense, what we'll discuss today, that is the bright rise of Rav Uziel to greatness, becoming the first Sephardic chief rabbi of Medinat Israel, and many other achievements that he had. So it's a very bright story on the one side, but on the other side, it's also the story of almost the last Mohican, the last remnant of this so ancient and important and proud Sephardic community. It's very difficult to trace after him more Rabbanim that see themselves as an integrate part of this Sephardic old tradition. What we call today the Sephardic chief rabbis that came after him, they are Sephardic in name because it came to be that all the Maghreb, what was called West, it's not necessarily, it's West if you compare it to Russia. It's not West if you compare it to Spain. However, we call the West the Maghreb, the Ma'arav, the Jews that lived under Muslim government. So they were Sfaradized by the Sfaradi after the explosion, after 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, and they mainly, of course, they came to be almost everywhere, also in the Ashkenazic world, but in the what we call today the Sephardic world, this is the Muslim world. So they went there en masse. So they became very dominant in the communities that they came into, and so these communities became to be known as Sephardic communities. Of course, you can be an Iraqi Jew that no one of your father or forefathers have ever been to Spain, because it's very far away from Iraq to Spain. But nonetheless, we now, all of them are under this one roof of Sephardic Jews. But these are very different traditions, very different traditions. And most, if not all, of the Sephardic rabbis that came after Rav Uziel were really, you may say, a Mizrahi rabbis, but not Sephardic rabbis in the way that he was. I don't think that any one of them was able, for example, to speak Ladino, which is a trademark. It's like Yiddish for the Ashkenazic rabbi is the Ladino for the real. If you, it's not chas v'chayil, I'm not giving grades. Each one came from his own tradition. But Rav Uziel was able, I mean, he was a Ladino speaker. He was able to speak Arabic also. But the rabbis that came after him were, their mother tongue was Arabic usually, or Iraq, the Iraqi version of Arabic, etc., and not necessarily that they were able even to understand, let alone speak in Ladino. So it's a very big change that for, I would guess, most of the people sitting here who are Ashkenazim, it doesn't really, they don't see it as so much of a difference. But the truth is that's a very big, it's a very big difference. You can think about how the Sephardi Jew would look at the difference between the Eastern European Jew and the Western European Jew. I guess that for most of us, that would be a great difference, right? Between the Eastern Eden, the Hasidic guys, and someone from Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch school. Right? This is very different. But for Sephardi, all of them are under the same rubric of an Ashkenazi. So in the same way, some of us may look at all of the Sfaradim as the same, but there is a great difference between Moroccans and Iraqis and real, again, I'm using the word real here, authentic Sfaradim that really came from Spain. They have very different traditions, although in many aspects, of course, they influenced each other. So he belongs to this old ancient tradition of the Sephardic Jews. And he's born in 1880, and he writes many years later that from a very young age, he knew, because of his heritage, that he is going to become a rabbi. That was something that was clear to him from a very, very, very young age, and his father raised him to this mission. However, unfortunately, his father passed away when he was only 14. And he became responsible, as the Bechor, as the firstborn, he became responsible to finance and to provide for his mother, the widow, and his two younger siblings. And he is going to work, he's off to work. I couldn't find any source that would say, what did he work in? It's very interesting, at the age of 14. I think, if I understand correctly, he was a part of the Beit Mitbachaim, of the Shechita. I don't think it was a shochet at the age of 14. That doesn't make any sense. But I know that at the age of 16 or 17, he was a shochet to vodek. He was, a bodek. So he would check the treifot after the slaughter. I don't think that at the age of 14 you would do it alone. Again, this is a very different world, and maybe he did, and he was obviously a genius from a very young age. But I don't think that they gave a child at the age of 14 to check treifot alone, but I guess that he was a helper and he learned the trade. He would use it many, many years later, as Be'ezrat Hashem I'm going to speak about. So at the age of 14, he is providing for his mother and two siblings, working at day and still learning, keeping his Torah learning at night. Because he came, as I said, from a very important family, then he got the privilege that he didn't get, it seems, the privilege that they would just let him sit and learn, as you would think that any child at the age of 14 should have. But this was a very different world, much, much poorer. There is nothing to compare. And it's under the Ottoman Empire, so obviously no social security, and no chinuch chova chinam, nothing like that existed, no free education. So if you had money, you could live. And if you didn't have money, then you can just die of hunger. No one would provide. The Kehila Yehudit would give some tzedakah, but they themselves, the Kehila in Yerushalayim, was extremely, extremely poor at the time, and at most of the times. So as I said, he's providing, but he had the privilege because of his family, because of genealogy, that some of the important Sephardic rabbis of the city would sit and would learn with him and would talk with him in Torah and would make sure that he is not falling behind. And that was, again, very, very important, both for his development as a Torah scholar and also for his feeling many years later that he is a part and parcel of this Sephardic tradition, because these were the ones that held him in his difficult times. Now he's even getting married at the age of 16 to the granddaughter of the Rav Rashi, the Rishon LeZion, the Sephardic Rishon LeZion of the time. Also, he has a dual capacity. He was the Rishon LeZion, meaning the chief Jewish rabbi, Jewish Israeli rabbi. He was also the Chacham Bashi. Chacham Bashi is a formal title by the Ottoman Empire, meaning that he is the Rav that is responsible for the relationship between the Jewish community and the Ottoman Empire. So it's the Chacham Bashi and the Rishon LeZion, that's Rav Eliashar, the grandfather of his wife. And as I said, they are getting married at 16. Now, there are different sources here. It seems that his father, before his passing, made the shidduch, but it was only carried out at a later date. According to one story, which the guy that tells it says that he heard it from Rav Uziel himself. So I'm passing it over. His father called him when he was 13 years old, the day of his bar mitzvah. Now, I don't know, what did you give to your child at the age of bar mitzvah? But his father told him, I know that I don't have much more to live, so I want to see you already, or how would you say, mesudar. So I want to see you not married, but at least that I know that you would be marrying the right girl. So they made the shidduch formal for his bar mitzvah gift. And as I said, it was only realized and done later at the age of 16, according to another account, the age of 18. I don't think it's such a difference. Who are his important rabbis of the time? So as I said, Rav Eliashar, obviously himself. Also, Rav Yaakov Meir. Rav Yaakov Meir, that maybe I should have also had a shiur about him, but you know what we say in Hebrew, מה שהלב חושק, הזמן נושק. What the heart wants, time deprives. So not always you are able to do everything and give everyone his due respect. Rav Yaakov Meir was a very important, also a Sephardic rabbi at the beginning of the 20th century. He was also the first chief rabbi under the British Mandate. That is Rav Yaakov Meir. He was a very interesting man, very scholar, knowledgeable obviously in halacha and Torah, but also very open to general culture. So a very interesting man. And he had a great impact on Rav Uziel. He induced him and he introduced him, and then he encouraged him to speak Ivrit, to speak Lashon HaKodesh, to not abandon Ladino, but not to learn Torah in Ladino. Torah should be learned Ivrit be'Ivrit. And also he encouraged him to participate or to begin to identify with the project of התעוררות לאומית, the Jewish national awakening that would later be seen as part of the ציונות. But ציונות is a political organization, it's a political tool. But even before we speak about ציונות, which is a mean, then the end is the Jewish national revival. And that is a thing that Rav Yaakov Meir was a very strong proponent of. And he, as I said, encouraged Rav Uziel to become a part to the extent that he had instructed him to learn Seder Zraim, that is the halachot of agriculture. Because he said nowadays, so I speak about the 1890s or the beginning of the 20th century, so the moshavot begin, the first aliyah, they begin to establish their communities and farms. So halachot that were not really learned in depth for 1,000 years, for more than 1,000 years, you'd begin to get questions very quickly. You cannot just know how to do slaughtering. That is the old rabbi. But now the new Israeli rabbi needs to know also the halachot of Trumot u'Maasrot. And what for us may be seen very, I guess that many of us in their gardens, etc. But there are many, many more complicated halachot, obviously, when you have a business of agriculture. And so he encouraged our hero, Rav Uziel, to learn Seder Zraim. He is also, very interesting in these years, very formative years of his, he is also establishing bridges with the Ashkenazi community, learning with Rav Shmuel Salant, was, I think, about whom we spoke. He was at this time, was a very old, the Ashkenazi rabbi of Yerushalayim, was a rabbi of Yerushalayim for many decades. He was very old at the time, and the young Rav Uziel wants not only to be a heir to this Sephardic tradition, he understands, and that would something that he would later become almost his motto, that he wants the new Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel not to be Sephardic and not to be Ashkenazic, not to be German, not to be Russian, not to be Moroccan. The new Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel should be Israeli. And that's why he says, if I want to become a Rav to this new Jewish people that come in, I need to be able to connect to everyone. So he goes also to Rav Shmuel Salant and learns with him. In exactly the 900, so he's 20, he becomes a teacher in the Talmud Torah and Yeshiva Tiferet Yerushalayim, which he himself learned in young age. And 2 years later, so at the age of 20, becomes a teacher. And as I said, meteoric rising. In the age of 22, he becomes the menahel of the Talmud Torah. So being a menahel of Talmud Torah at the age of 22, I think it's a nice achievement. Obviously, he's extremely skilled. He is also very liked and loved as a mechanech. What the students attest to is the respect that he showed them. Back then, in Yerushalayim, but not only in Yerushalayim, education was based many, many times on either physical violence, real physical violence, and if not, then at least threatening, intimidation, very strong education. And he came in, and he was not about punishing. Now, that's, again, it may be that for us, the pendulum, the metutelet, went so, pendulum, went so far into the extreme other side that we now say, we deleted all the boundaries, we need more strong education now. But for them back then, that was a real step in the right direction, because the youngs were leaving the fold. I don't think that that's something that would be sensational to you, that in the beginning of the 20th century, many people that their parents were what we would call today Orthodox, that's of course anachronistic, but we would call today Orthodox or Datiim or religious, so the young would grow up and would be exposed at one point or another to the new Western world and worldview, and would say, you know, I didn't really buy into what I learned as a child, but I just forced into that. So as long as there was no viable alternative, then that's what I have. But in the minute that I would have some alternative, I would go to the alternative. And young Jews were living faith. And then you had two ways how to react. One way was, if when they are exposed to the alternative they leave, what we should do is stop exposing them to the alternative. So building high walls. So that was one way of thinking, which would nowadays call Haredi. Of course, again, that's anachronistic, but more or less. And the other direction was, we need to strengthen the chinuch that we give our children, so they would not be, when they would be exposed, they would not be drifting away, but they would be able rather to maybe integrate into our life and system and thinking the best and the honest of what maybe other cultures has to suggest. And obviously Rav Uziel belonged to this second approach. So as the menahel of Yeshiva Tiferet Yerushalayim, he is not only managing the school, he is also establishing a Beit Yetomim, a house for orphans. Now, I think that's obviously because of his own personal history. So he knew and understood what is the meaning of being an orphan. And he said, we need to make sure that these children don't have to work in order to provide their family. They would get free food and free teaching in my school. And that was the Beit Yetomim that he established. And also he established a yeshiva for rabbis. So he wanted, and that was mainly aimed at Sfaradim in Yerushalayim. So they would become, he wanted to train them to become rabbis that would be able to face this modern new world that is emerging. And they call this yeshiva Machzikei Torah, and he made sure, again, he understood the importance of money. So he made sure, it was called Machzikei Torah, holding the Torah, because he made sure that there was a stipend that would be paid to the avrechim that are training themselves to be rabbis, so they would be able really to invest their time in serious Torah learning. Unfortunately, the institution held for 6 years, and then it was one of his relatives, a rich relative of his, that made Aliyah and was contributing the money. And then, you know, as it had to be, many Jews back then were making Aliyah when they were already in an old age. So this relative only survived for 6 years, and then he passed away. And again, I don't have the information, but I would guess that the children not necessarily held or subscribed to the same beliefs, so they didn't want to continue and helping and sustaining the yeshiva, and the yeshiva was closed after only 6 years. However, even if it may be that the institution itself did not survive, it still, I think, represents what Rav Uziel was trying to achieve. 8 years later, so we are going on to 1910. So he's now 30, and there is a Beit Midrash that is established by the Aguda called Ezra. Now, this is a Germanic company, we may say, or organization of Jews, and they want to train Rabbanim of their own in Yerushalayim. But they are so impressed with the work that Rav Uziel is doing that although he's a Sephardic rabbi, they invite him to teach in Ezra. So he's also becoming a teacher to the Ashkenazic Beit Midrash in Yerushalayim. And here again, you see his ability to bridge between the different worlds that are now coming together in the new and built Eretz Israel. In 1911, we are still under the Ottoman Empire, we remember. So in 1911, there is a need in the new established Tel Aviv. Rav Kook is the Rav of Tel Aviv. And everything, more or less, everyone are happy with Rav Kook as the Rav of Tel Aviv. However, the Ottomans are not happy because Rav Kook is not an Ottoman citizen. He came from Lithuania, from Russia, basically. So in order to be a formal Rav in the Ottoman Empire, you need to be an Ottoman citizen. And I think, if I remember correctly, that one of the conditions, you needed to be 3 generations citizen of the Ottoman Empire in order to hold a formal position. So not Rav Kook and not his son and not his grandson, for the matter, would be able to become the Rav of Tel Aviv. It was dependent on the Ottomans. And in order to have all the formalities, you needed to register deaths and births, lehavdil, and marriages. So you needed someone. And also they thought Rav Kook was so engaged with everything and everyone, you needed someone to be there and manage the city, the day-to-day life in the city. Maybe if you can close the door, thank you. Thank you so much. So they are looking for a rabbi that is an Ottoman citizen. So you need it to be a Sephardic almost for sure. And they decide to bring the young 30 years old Rav Uziel, 31 years old, to serve as the chief Sephardic rabbi, it may be called, of Tel Aviv, standing next to Rav Kook. Now they wait, because Rav Uziel was, as I said, he was Ohev Shalom, he was lover of peace. And he didn't want it to have the feeling that he is competing against Rav Kook or taking from his authority. So they more or less divided the position that Rav Kook was responsible for almost everything that had to do with strict halachic religious questions. And Rav Uziel was responsible for many of, you may say, of the formal work. But it was not only formal work of registering and writing. It was almost, I would say, it became the manager, the administrative manager of Tel Aviv. It became extremely important function because because many of the builders of Tel Aviv were Eastern European. So again, they couldn't really speak with the Ottomans. They didn't know the language. They didn't know the culture. They held no formal standing in the Ottoman Empire. So almost everything that they wanted to do had to pass through Rav Uziel. And that made him a very important player in what was becoming the Zionist movement in Eretz Israel. So it's very interesting that while Rav Kook held a very dual relationship, we may say, with the Zionist movement, which we described when we spoke about Rav Kook. Of course, he encouraged and supported settling in Eretz Israel, but he had many, many objections against the Zionist movement as an organization, and even tried at a certain point to establish Degel Yerushalayim, which was supposed to be a competing, we may say, organization to the Histadrut HaTzionit. Rav Uziel was a complete part of the Tzionut. And by that, again, he was able to bridge between the Sephardic world that he came from and the Zionist movement that was almost completely an Ashkenazic enterprise. So again, for us, these are things that looks very simple. But back then, this was a very unique ability to be able to have a foot in every world that he was stepping in. When he was crowned as the rabbi of Tel Aviv, he made a speech, a drasha, very long one. This was the minhag back then. I think drashot, where if you didn't speak for 2 hours, then you're not considered someone serious. I just brought you the very last sentences of his speech. You can please pass them over. I would also share it in the Zoom. Yes, it's for 2 sides. So in source Aleph. So that's from his Drashat ההכתרה, his crowning speech, Rabbanut Yafo-Tel Aviv. It's not Tel Aviv-Yafo, because Yafo is much larger than Tel Aviv. So it's Yafo-Tel Aviv and the Moshavot, 1911. And he says, these are the last few sentences. רצוני הכביר, my might will is לאחד את קרעי הגלות שהתהוו בנו בדמות קהילות ועדות של ספרדים, אשכנזים, תימנים ועוד. He says, I have a strong will, a mighty will, רצוני הכביר, to unite all the different communities and ethnicities of Jews. We became Sfaradim and Ashkenazim and Yemenites and more and more. בשובנו אל הארץ, as we return to the land, אין כל סיבה להמשיך את הפירוד הגלותי לקהילות וללשונות. So there is no reason anymore to continue seeing ourselves through these lenses, which are of the diaspora. Now, this is very extreme. It says, why should I be considered Sephardi? Or why should you be considered Ashkenazi? We are all Jews in Eretz Israel. So we need to stop this separation of different communities and different languages. קהילה אחת תאחד אותנו בפנימיותנו. We should be one community in our internal feeling, internal organs. ותייצג אותנו כלפי הממשלה. We should also come to the government as one. Not as the Sephardic chief rabbi, so although he was crowned as the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, he almost immediately opposed, it's very interesting, he is opposing this title. He says, I will be very happy to be a Rav, I have no problem working with Rav Kook, but why should we split it according to Ashkenazim and Sfaradim? We can have whatever way of diffusing the work among us, Rav Kook and I and myself, but there is no reason why it should be seen as a question of עדה, of community. לשון אחת תהיה בפי כולנו. We should all speak the same language, not Yiddish and not Ladino, but עברית. בבית וברחוב, at home and in the street, בעיר ובשדה. So again, this is very extreme. Even today, it seems very extreme. So you can only think about back then. He says, our language is the language of the Torah, the prophecy, the Mishnah. So I would ask you, he's now asking the people that he's delivering the speech to, אבקש עזרה ועצה, I would ask you for help and advice לעבודה מסונפת, is complicated and responsible work that the age, the time are putting on our shoulders. So that's another very interesting sentence. He is very aware to the greatness of the time. This is also something that rises up again and again, that he doesn't see himself only as continuing the tradition of his forefathers, which was a great, mighty mission in itself. He sees himself as living in unique times, which requires of him unique actions and unique points of view. Now, that made him into also, we may say, an address to some critique. Because you can understand that he says we need to make Am Yisrael back into one. Then in some things it may be that the Ashkenazim would become more Sfaradized. I hope that we'll be able to have the time, Bezrat Hashem, to learn is a very interesting tshuva about how you should daven, in what accent. So that's a very interesting question, and he gave a very interesting answer. But in other areas, it would have to be, if you want to be one, you cannot only take, you must also give. Now you have to remember that in their time, under the Ottoman Empire, the only one holding real power are the Sfaradim. So again, we need to change maybe our mindset a little, because it would change in just a few years. But in this time we are speaking about the first 20 years, we may say, of the 20th century, the Sfaradim are very strong. Now, the Ashkenazim becoming to come in very large numbers, so things begin to change. But many of the Ashkenazim that come are not religious. So religious-wise, it's still the Sfaradim that are holding the power in the sway, especially in Yerushalayim and in other places, and speaking with the Ottoman Empire. And for him, this is a step back from power. When he says we must all need to be one, he doesn't say, I would now make us all one by the power of my authority that the Ottoman Empire gave me, because I can ban and I can excommunicate and I can do many things that the Ashkenazi rabbi cannot do. He says we need to sit together and to find a way to create something that is a whole. And many years later, 60 years later, Rav Ovadia Yosef would become the chief Sephardic rabbi of Tel Aviv. Now again, this is many years later. And Rav Ovadia Yosef was asked in the first year that he was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, the Sephardic chief rabbi, can a Sephardi make a wedding in the days between Yud Zayin Tammuz and Rosh Chodesh Av? So according to the Ashkenazi custom in Europe, then you cannot do weddings from Yud Zayin Tammuz to Tisha B'Av. According to the Sephardic, again, Sephardic, we are now making a blanket, a carpet statement about many, many communities, but according to many, we would say Sephardic communities, then weddings are allowed up till Rosh Chodesh Av. So and for many years, the Rabbanut in Tel Aviv did not allow weddings from Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, not to Ashkenazim and not to Sfaradim. And now Rav Ovadia Yosef is becoming the chief Sephardic rabbi of Tel Aviv. And the question is coming to him, can you allow a wedding for a Sephardic couple in Tel Aviv in these days from Yud Zayin Tammuz and before Rosh Chodesh Av? And in source bet you can see his answer. So this is from Rav Ovadia Yosef. שמעתי שיש טוענים על דבריי. He's writing it in his Yabia Omer, in his response. I heard that there are those that argue against me. שמאחר שהרבנים הראשיים לתל אביב יפו שכדמוני הניחו המנהג להחמיר, אין לשנות המנהג. He says, some claim against me that, it may be that the Sephardic custom in Iraq or in Morocco was to marry after Yud Zayin Tammuz, but it is not the minhag in Tel Aviv, because in Tel Aviv for 60 years already, no weddings are being done during the Shloshet HaShavuot. So his answer is, Lav Miltai. This is not something that I consider as important. שבמקום הניחו לי להתגדר בו, I was given a place to act, to work it. מכל שכן שידוע שהרבנים הראשיים הספרדים שקדמוני, it is known, he says, that the chief Sephardic rabbis before me הבו מי כף כיפי לעמיתיהם הרבנים הראשיים האשכנזים. They were מי כף כיפי. I'm wondering how to translate that in a way that would be respectful. Subservient? No, that's too harsh, right? But they were under the authority of the Ashkenazic chief rabbis. And if someone is wondering about who he's aiming at, he's saying it out aloud. הגאון רב בן ציון עוזיאל ז"ל, הויקייף להגאון הרב אברהם יצחק הכהן קוק זצ"ל. Says, the fact is that Rav Ben Zion Uziel was accepting the yoke, the authority of Rav Kook. So Rav Kook decided that according to Ashkenazic minhag there would be no marrying, no weddings at the שלושת השבועות. So Rav Uziel agreed. But now he says that, and he says Rav Uziel even wanted that there would be no separate shchita for Sfaradim and Ashkenazim. And Rav Yosef says when Rav Uziel suggested that, even some of the Ashkenazic Haredi rabbis opposed. They said, if you would cancel the Sephardi Shrita, we will, the Ashkenazic Haredi rabbis, will arrange Sephardic Shrita. Why? Because we see it as important that people would continue the minhag of the fathers. And so says Rav Yosef, but now, Baruch Hashem, I am not Meikaf Kayef. I am not subservient anymore, and I am bringing out aloud the Sephardic voice, and according to the Sephardic tradition, we are allowed to do Chatunot from Zayin Tammuz to Rosh Chodesh Av. So you see that even 60 years later, this is a burning question. It's not a simple question. It's not a simple question. Uziel had a very strong position. I don't think that it's because he was Meikaf Kayef. He was subservient. He wanted to make harmony between the different parts of the nation, and also between himself and Rav Kook. That's also correct. So he let Rav Kook decide, as I said, some of the halachic matters in things that he didn't thought were of such importance. So I think that's extremely telling about the personality of Rav Uziel, and also I believe it's part of what I said in the beginning. That is that Rav Uziel was, on one hand, he was extremely important and influential in the creation of the chief rabbinate. On the other hand, in a sense, he was a less remnant to something that had no continuation later, because other rabbis with different agendas, and without right now judging between them, but different agendas took the important positions after him. He was not able to create a cadre. I'm saying now half things, but I think it should be said that while he had some important Talmidim, maybe the most known of them is Rav Chaim David HaLevi, who was also a chief rabbi in Tel Aviv, but he was not able to create a cadre of students that would become important rabbis and would take leading positions after his ptira. And so some of his legacy remained unrealized. Okay, returning to our story. In the 3 years between 1911 that he became the chief rabbi and the outbreak of the First World War, he is, as I said, he is becoming a part of the body of the Zionist movement. He is responsible for the establishing of new neighborhoods in Tel Aviv. And he is also establishing a Talmud Torah called Sha'arei Tzion in Tel Aviv. And again, this Talmud Torah continued to operate as long as he was there. After he left, the Talmud Torah was closed. However, this Talmud Torah was trying to integrate Limudei Chol and Limudei Kodesh. In 1914, the First World War breaks. And in the beginning, many of the Jews in Eretz Israel are being exiled because the Turks, the Ottomans, are worried, they are suspicious, and in some way they were correct that the Jews really prefer the British than the Turks. Now, there was a very good a few hundred years of reasons why the Jews preferred the English and not the Ottomans. However, the Ottomans were afraid that the Jews would cooperate and maybe spy for the sake of the English. And that's why many Jews were exiled. Rav Kook himself, as if you remember, he went to some committee for some health reason before the war and then got stuck. He couldn't return. So Rav Uziel remained the only rabbi in Tel Aviv. And things were extremely difficult because, as I said, many Jews were exiled and the streets were empty and there was no food. And there are stories, heartbreaking stories about the hunger in Yafo and Tel Aviv at the time, and he himself sees again young Jewish boys without parents to be able to help them, and he's trying to assist them. However, there are, as I said, some very, very sad stories, the way that he even had sometimes to collect the bodies of the children from the streets. These were very, very difficult times in Eretz Israel of the time. But again, he became very outstanding in his helping and being always first himself in his body to help the community. At a certain point, the Ottomans decided that he also is dangerous, and they exiled him to Damascus. They only allowed him to return because they tried to force him. The British were already beginning to conquer, and they were making head north. So the Ottomans hoped that if they would allow him to return to Tel Aviv or to Jerusalem, he would be able to recruit from the Jews spies against the British. Now, he didn't want to, but on the other hand, they threatened his life. And the happy end was he was given a date. You must, to a certain date, recruit Jewish spies. However, the British were able, again, General Allenby was able to conquer Jerusalem before the date came. And so Rav Uziel is one. There is a very famous photograph of Allenby. Allenby, when he came to Jerusalem, he didn't want to ride a horse because of the holiness. I mean, these were different times. So the British army, the general said, I won't go with a horse into Jerusalem because of its holiness. I would go down from my horse and come in by foot. So he's taking down from his horse, and a few important representatives of the different countries are accompanying him. And in the photo, you can see Rav Uziel with his special Sephardic rabbinic clothes, also accompanying General Allenby. So this is in 1914, and then he returns to Tel Aviv and continues his work as the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. In 1919, he is establishing with others the Mizrahi of Eretz Israel. So the Mizrahi, as you remember, was established by Rav Reins in Russia, and the Mizrahi means it's a Rashi Tevot of Merkaz Ruchani. So this is an attempt to be a part of the Zionist organization, but to give it a more spiritual, religious figure. And Rav Uziel is extremely identified with all the values that the Mizrahi are advancing. That is, of course, most important, being completely part of the Jewish awakening in Eretz Israel, so that's forward foremost, but also openness to general culture, openness to sciences. He is an advocate of all of these goals and ideals. So he's establishing the Mizrahi in Eretz Israel. He's becoming a speaker. He goes from place to place, raising funds and also raising members to this organization of the Mizrahi. In 1921, Tafresh Pei Aleph, one of the first pogroms that the Arabs under the British Mandate are committing against the Jews. It also happens in Yafo. And Rav Uziel, very bravely, when he hears that the Arabs are attacking the Jewish quarter, so he's walking to there with his rabbinical grab, and he had some respect in the Arab among the Arab citizens, so he was able to calm them down at least for a few hours. After that, it was resumed. But we have some testimonies of him standing there in front of this whole crowd, armed. He was not armed; they were armed. And he was able to talk them down. He said to them, you know, the Jews are now returning to the land. You should know that God had promised that when the Jews would return to the land, it would begin to provide. So all of us would be able to enjoy. If we would be able to sit together, then we would all be able to enjoy the blessing of the land, which, you know, for us would seem extremely naive. But he held this position throughout all of his life, as we would see also later. He really believed that all of us, the Jews and the Arabs, can live here together and enjoy the bracha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would give in the land. At that time, Rav Yaakov Meir, which we spoke about earlier, if you remember, was one of his rabbis in Jerusalem. So Rav Yaakov Meir at the time served as the chief rabbi of Saloniki. Now, we have to understand for a minute what Saloniki was. Saloniki was maybe the most important Jewish city in the Sephardic world. It was a big European city, rich because of the port, the seaport, the Namal. And it was mainly Jewish. So it's not only New York, they say, was closed. The stock exchange was sometimes closed on Yom Kippur. But there, the seaport was closed on Shabbat. The banks would be closed on Shabbat because the main population of Saloniki is about 60,000 Jews living there. So it was a huge community, very prosperous, very rich, very successful, and very quiet and calm. And in 1920, so Rav Yaakov Meir was the Rav there, and in 1921, Rav Yaakov Meir is asked by the British to become the chief rabbi in Israel for the mandat. So he is heading to Israel, and he asked Rav Uziel, can you replace me in Saloniki? And Rav Uziel at the beginning declines. He doesn't want to go to Saloniki. He wants to stay in Tel Aviv. He loves Tel Aviv. He loves the people. He loves everything. But Rav Meir puts a lot of pressure on him. And in the end, he accepts. And he goes to Saloniki. Now, Saloniki suffers at the time greatly. A, there was a great fire that consumed very large portions of the city. And B, more important, is that the Greeks got their independence. And that was very good for the Greeks, but a calamity for the Jews. Because the Greeks were very national, and they didn't want the Jews controlling one of the richest cities of their land. So they used the fire. Some even claim that they began it. Now, that's something that no one can prove. But they used the fire as an excuse to, they said, okay, places were burned down. We, the government, would oversee their rebuild. And because we are paying for it, then now it would become, they nationalized basically most of the city that belonged to the shuls, to Jewish day schools. Everything almost was taken from the Jews. And then also there was the war, because in Eastern Europe, in the Balkan, First World War did not end in Versailles. It ended much later. So wars continued to rage in Eastern Europe. Also the Greeks were, so there were plitim, right, refugees, Greek refugees. And the government wanted to force the Jews to accept the Greek refugees in Saloniki, because they said, you have place here, everything was burned down. So as you can understand, all of this pressure was not doing good for the Jewish community. And Rav Uziel went there and he was doing his best. What basically he said to the Jews there is, you need to make aliyah. And that's the end of this community. And as long as you are still able to, just make aliyah. Now, no one liked him saying that. Not the Jews that lived in Saloniki, and not the Greeks, which thought that he was smearing them. However, he was encouraging the Jews to make aliyah. 10,000 of the Jewish residents of Saloniki heed to his advice and made aliyah. About other 50,000 stayed in Saloniki, and as some of you may know, they were sent to the gas chambers in Poland in the Second World War. The people that heard to Rav Uziel saved themselves and their lives, which is a trademark of a great man, I think, that was able to see ahead what is going to happen. He had been there for 2 years, from 1921 to 1923, and then he returned to Tel Aviv. Meir Dizengoff, the legendary first head Meir of Tel Aviv, kept the position for him because they liked him so much. So they told him, you are only going there as a shlichut, right, to Saloniki, but then you are back here. And so he came back at 1923 and stayed there for another 16 years. So he was for more than 20 years. In sum total, he was a rabbi of Tel Aviv, Yafo. And during this time, unfortunately, his wife passed away. And he remarried. He had 5 children from his wife that now they themselves became orphaned. And again, I think that he really was able to feel what is the meaning of being orphaned. And he remarried a few years later with another very important a woman from I guess she was also, I'm sure, very important, but I don't know. But she was from a very important family from Haleb. Aleppo is now in the title, right in the head. In the headline, thank you. So from Aleppo is Chaleb. Chaleb, Chet and Aleph, Lamed is the Lamed, and Pei is Bet. So it's, yeah, Chaleb is Aleppo. Aleppo. So from a very important family called Altras. He was also going around as the head of the Mizrahi. He went to Iraq to encourage Jews in Iraq to make Aliyah, and he also had an interview with the king, King Faisal. And he was encouraged, King Faisal was, in a sense, in a way, he was appreciative of Zionism, and he tried again to create this idea, now that we know it as the Abrahamic Accords. Right? So he was trying to create these feelings of alliance of the children of Avraham Avinu with the Arabs. And King Faisal, in a sense, was able to hear that, but King Faisal himself was removed from his throne only a few years later. So that didn't help a lot. Then he made the tour in New York, not only New York, in all of the United States for a few months. He spoke, thousands of Jews came. From the testimonies, we know that most didn't understand a word that he was saying. He was speaking in Hebrew, in Sephardic accent. No one there was able to understand that. But they say they were impressed with the atmosphere that he created around him. He also met there, I mean, King Faisal is one kavod, but he also met there with President Coolidge, was the United States president back then. When he came out, so he was very impressed with the wealth of the Jews in America at the time, but he wrote them, I would almost say, a scolding letter. It's here in source Gimel. Our time begins to become shorter, but he says there, you have a beautiful community. In the land, he says, of the Chofesh ve'adror, right? In the land of the free. However, he says, I see a few grave dangers to the future, and he writes that again in the 20s. He says a few grave dangers to the future of Judaism. He says it's the reform. So the reform movement is creating, is damaging Jewish tradition, which is the root upon which we sit and stand. So that's one, he says. And second, he says, I am seeing that you don't have good enough Jewish education. And so it doesn't matter even, no, it does matter, but he would say reform or Orthodox, but you need to educate. If you send your children to public schools, which was the trend among Jewish immigrants at the time to the United States, then what are the chances that they would return their Jewishness? Which, of course, he was completely correct at this observation. And then he says something very poignant. He says, it would be extremely sad if traditions that we upheld through persecutions and suffering, now that we came to be free, we would abandon and leave it behind. What does it mean about our commitment to what we are handed that was bought in such high prices? This was very moving words. I don't know to what extent he was able to make a dent on American Jews, but to us, I think it's very important and moving. He returns to Eretz Israel. In 1939, Rav Yaakov Meir passes away, and Rav Yaakov Meir had already arranged, 2 years before that when he would pass, that Rav Uziel would become the Sephardic chief rabbi of the Mandat after him, and Rav Uziel is called from Tel Aviv to make Aliyah to Yerushalayim and become the chief rabbi, the chief Sephardic rabbi. His peer, his fellow rabbi, the Ashkenazi rabbi, was Rav Herzog, another very important figure. Bezrat Hashem will speak also about him in a future shiur. As we all know, in 1948, I of course skip here a lot. In 1948, the establishment of Medinat Israel. During the War of Independence, Yerushalayim was suffering a siege, and Rav Uziel pasken that you are allowed to make works on Shabbat, and he himself went out on Shabbat and dug some of the holes, right, so chafirot, some of the fortifications for the sake, in order to defend the city. And he was already 60 years old. So the commander of the Haganah in Yerushalayim, David Shaltiel, approached him and said, Rabbi, we have enough workers here. You can go home and rest. And Rav Uziel says, I believe that every stroke of land I am helping the salvation of Am Israel, and that's a mitzvah I would not leave to anyone else to perform. And B, if I would sit at home, then other religious Jews would say that the hater may be not so well-founded. But when they see me working, they know that that is something they need to follow. Later, he made sure that both of his sons, he had 2 sons and 3 daughters, both of his sons were recruited to the Haganah and to what was then beginning to be formed as Tzahal. So in the famous discussion about the recruitment of the Talmidei Yeshivot, his position was he had a very clear voice. And after the end of the war, he's being crowned as the first chief Sephardic rabbi of the state of Israel. There are many, many stories about the way that he approached everyone. As I said, he gave respect to everyone and to every man. I don't have the time, so I'll just tell one, I think, example story, and that is there was a widow that would come once a week to he gave her some tzedakah, and she would give him brachot. And she spoke with no end, and she really wasted his very, very precious time. But every week she came and he sat there and received the brachot. And once his secretary tried to stop the widow when she came into the reception room. So he tried to stop her. He said, I would give you the money and you can give me the brachot and I would hand them over to the Rav. And the Rav heard it from his study room and he called her in. And she went in and gave him all the brachot, etc. And then she went out. And the secretary told the Rav, I'm trying to defend you and to help you save time because you have so little time at your hands. And the Rav told him, you don't understand what a widow is. I know what a widow is because he remembered his mother. And he said, the brachot that she is giving me are more important to me and to her than the money I get. She's not coming for the money. She's coming to feel that she's a human being and that what she says is important and that the Rav Rashi is giving her the time and space. And so that's the type of a person that he was. At 1953, so he remained the chief rabbi for 5 years, from 48 to 53. He was extremely influential in establishing the Rabbanut, the Takanot of the Rabbanut. He believed strongly that the Jewish state should be managed by the laws of the Torah, and also that the laws of the Torah should be expanded in a way that would enable them to become the governing mechanism for a modern state, because if you only remain with what you had, then obviously you are not able to face the challenges. Now, this was a breakthrough vision, I guess, but it was something that was not just non-viable at this time, mostly because the other rabbis did not support it. The other rabbis said, or that the Jewish state would completely hand over all the judgment to Torah, or that we do not want to become a part of it, because we do not want to accept that in some areas the state does not follow the Torah. And he believed that you need to take whatever you can and to influence however you are able to. And he believes that, as we saw, he's completely against reform in halacha. But he said halacha should react to the current situation. And so in inheritance, in questions of women voting rights, he was one of the rabbis that supported that women would have the right to vote, which we would consider modern rabbis were opposing. And in many other important aspects of modern life, he thought that we need to try and be as relevant and as we can, because the Torah has what to say. If you are completely non-relevant to the world, then what the Torah has to say to the world becomes also non-relevant. And he did his best. He did his best. As I said, it was an extremely difficult mission. He was not helped by others. Nonetheless, he was extremely important in almost all the foundation and what is accepted by the Rabbanut to this very day. In 1953, at the summer, he was already a few years sick with diabetes. And as you know, many people, especially in those days, they were not aware enough to the damages that can bring. And in 1953, there was unfortunately, he became very, very, very sick, and they had to amputate his leg. But even that didn't help; it was just suffering. And 20 days later, he passed away. And he wrote a Tzava'ai, last will, which back then was very famous. And I think it's worth reading and finishing with that. I apologize for finishing late today, but it's because of Rosh Chodesh. So that's the last source. Source A. אודה להשם, this is the last words. אודה להשם בכל לבב בסוד ישרים ודאי. Thank God with all my heart in our community that he granted me to be born on the knees of my forefathers and set me in front of my good and straight teachers. And together my fathers and my teachers taught me the right way to go. Because from my beginning, בזכותם נועדתי מראשית ימיי. I was designated from my first days לשרת את הציבור. So he saw himself as a public servant. And in my roles, and then he describes his life, which we have done throughout this year, and then he says, in my roles, I put before my eyes and as a candle to my path, the next goals, to teach Torah and love of God, and to increase the love and peace among the Jewish nation. And he says, these two goals for me are one, loving Hashem and the love among Am Israel. And he says, these are the goals that always I navigated according to them. And he says, I add and say, you must hear me, my brothers, my people, and God would hear you. It is a great merit in our generation, as the strong hand of God had appeared in our times and gathers us from among the nations and brought us back to sit on our land. We must hold these two pillars of love of God and the unity among us in order to become stable and to be able to oppose the forces of destruction that try, he says, המקיפים אותנו בטבעת חנק. That's what we speak today about the ring of fire, right? The Iranian ring of fire. So he says there is a ring of choke that is trying to choke us, the Arab world, and to destroy us, and to erase the name of Am Israel from the face of earth. We must, הסירו כל גורמי הפירוד והמחלוקת ממחננו ומדינתנו. We must remove all of what is causing separation and disunity among us. And instead we must stand גורמי שלום ואחדות. We need to establish ways of creating peace and unity and harmony, so our camp would be tahor, would be pure. Now this is very interesting use of words, because usually when you speak about pureness, we speak about or liberating other elements which are considered impure. But he says no. You know what pureness means? Pureness means pure love and being able to stand together. And then would be like a fortress that cannot be destroyed. And God that makes peace in his, right, עושה שלום במרומיו, that is making peace in the skies, in heaven, he would also make peace among us and would bless us as Hashem, as told us by Moshe Rabbeinu, his prophet, Hashem Elokechem yirba itchem, Kadosh Baruch Hu had made us plentiful and many, and may he increase the Am Israel 1,000 times more and would bless Am Israel. God would give force to Am Israel, and he says, Hineni achichem, I'm your brother, hanifrad mikem lechaye olam haba, and now I'm departing for the next world with the peace, with the blessing of peace, בברכת שלום וגאולת עולם, hoping for final ultimate redemption, בתקומת כיסא מלכות בית דוד, that we see the house of David being rethroned, ובניין מקדש השם, and the building of the temple בעיר הקודש בירושלים, בן ציון מאיר חי Uziel, which is, I think, is the last will from 1953. So that is what, 70 years ago, but it speaks to our ears as it was written yesterday. So thank you very much, and we would continue Bezrat Hashem next week.
תודה רבה. חודש טוב.